Industrial Revolution, Part 3. In considering the Industrial Revolution and the enormous industrial and economic development that occurred in England between the years 1760 and 1830, one of the most important things for us to do is to examine the various accusations that have been made against the industrialists and businessmen to see whether or not they are valid. In earlier discussions, I have already taken up some of the factors that related to conditions ahead of the Industrial Revolutionary period. But let me now confine myself to the actual accusations that have been made and to meeting those accusations with the best information that I know of in existence. Here are the charges that have been leveled at industrialists generally. 1. That they exploited human beings by forcing them to work in factories at pitifully low wages and at very, very long hours. 2. In addition to treating ordinary human beings this way, not content with that, the industrialists also brought into the factory women and children who were subjected to the same rules and to the same long hours and low pay. 3. That the treatment of the factory owners and the managers of these factories was fundamentally cruel and actually indifferent to the human requirements of the workers, to the degree that the builders of factories virtually ignored the comfort and decent necessities for human beings in a working situation and built what are called sweatshops with the insufficient air, insufficient lighting, conditions so poor that they themselves constituted a hazard to health and even to life. 4. That the machinery was not protected, and consequently many accidents occurred in the factories, most of them unnecessary, and thus there was a degree of crippling, maiming, and killing in factories so that they were hazardous in the extreme. 5. That in addition to general indifference to the human condition of the workers so employed, actual cruelty was imposed upon the workers so that sometimes they were beaten. There is even a report that on one occasion children were chained to the benches and thus compelled to work terribly long hours at virtually galley slave conditions. This was not only a charge leveled relating to the conditions of child labor, but we have the accusation that sometimes men were forced to walk on treadmills in order to provide power. Indeed, the charges leveled against the industrialists have tended to make them appear as subhuman fiends, virtually engaged in a conspiracy to take advantage of unprotected humanity and exploit them as a result of their own greed for profits and greed for power. Now, these are the basic accusations. I don't think there is any longer very much question of the fact that the Industrial Revolutionary period did result in substantial upgrading of the human condition. This has, I think, at least in recent years, been acknowledged by most writers in the area. However, they still tend to argue that these economic gains, while admitted, were brought about through the imposition of cruelty and virtually enslavement conditions which were not necessary, and that fortunately the government was called in to intervene, and laws regulating the behavior of employers, notably in respect to wages, hours, and the employment of children, began to be enacted. So I'd like to deal with these accusations in turn. First of all, it is let me take the question of the sweatshops. I'm not really certain what a sweatshop is, unless presumably one could take it literally and assume that it is a shop where sweating ensues. Obviously, any place where people work hard and perspire could be called a sweatshop. As a matter of fact, I have heard modern workers refer to even the most delightfully air-conditioned places where they work as sweatshops when they have to work a long time. So this is a bit of opprobrium that is not necessarily leveled at the industrialists. Nonetheless, the charge does adhere to them. So let's take a look at the factories that were constructed and to see whether or not the businessmen were responsible for this type of thing. Is it true that the factories were airless, cheerless, windowless, and miserable places? I think that charge is true. In general, the factories, by our standards of comparison, were pretty bad places. We wouldn't have liked to work in them, and I have no doubt that the people who lived at that time didn't like to work in them either. As a matter of fact, very few of us really enjoy the kind of labor that is involved in a textile mill or a steel mill. It's hard, exacting work, and it goes on for long hours, then and now. And the people engaged in such activities rarely rejoice in the work they do. They may rejoice in the wage they receive, if it's a good wage, but they certainly don't warm up to the long and arduous hours they have to put in. But now let's take a look at the charge, which is essentially this, that the businessmen deliberately ignored the human wants and human requirements and simply built the cheapest and most expeditious type of factory that they could in order to save money and to get into production as quickly as possible. That charge actually is untrue. In point of fact, the businessmen were doing their level best to make their factories bigger and brighter and airier from the beginning. Why? Well, there's a very selfish reason involved, but let's face it. It was important to the businessmen that they enjoy as long a working day as possible. At the time we are speaking of, back in the beginning of the latter half of the 18th century, we did not have anything that could bring us adequate interior lighting except the sunlight from outside. Thus it behooved the industrialists to put in as many windows to bring in as much sunlight as possible. However, when businessmen sought to do this and to make their factories bigger and brighter and airier and more cheerful places so that they could work their workers longer, and that was the main motivation, the fact was that the government itself prohibited it. There were laws governing construction, building codes that had to be adhered to, and there was a general belief that every time you added a window to a building, you weakened the structure. Unless, of course, it happened to be a church. Churches seem to be immune to weakening. But any public place, that is where people would tend to congregate in groups, had to be limited as to the number of windows that would put in. So many of the factories were unnecessarily dark, not because the businessmen wanted it that way. On the contrary, they wanted it the other way, because it would have been to their advantage the other way. But they were unable to do it because of laws limiting their behavior in this particular. Again, another inhibiting factor occurred. Earlier in France, under the reign of Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, a law had been passed that derived from the notion that Louis XIV took, that since he was divine and the special emissary of God on earth, he was actually the one to control the sunlight. And therefore everyone had to pay a tax on the amount of sunlight that came through the windows in any building that they erected that had windows. Consequently, when the businessman found himself in a position where he could add great expanses of glass, he found himself unable to pay the tax. And this also inhibited the free use of glass as much as it could have been done. The tax on windows was later dropped in England, but it still continues in force today in France, I'm informed. It is called a window tax, but in essence it is a derivative of the earlier tax on sunlight put in by Louis XIV when the tax was computed on the number of square inches of sunlight that could come in through the window pane. So there you have one of the inhibiting factors. What about the accusation of the long hours? Is that true? Yes, indeed it is true. Workers worked very long hours. This was to the advantage of the businessmen, and they wanted long hours during at least part of the time. Now, take for a moment a look at the geographic location of England. You'll note that it is actually on a parallel, virtually opposite Labrador. It is very far to the north. Most of us tend to think of London as being opposite New York, geographically speaking. Well, New York is really opposite Rome, Italy, and London is much further north. In fact, it is very nearly in the Arctic Circle. Now, if you've ever enjoyed a trip to England, as I have, you will become aware at once of the fact that in the summertime, the days are very long indeed. The sun begins to come up as early as maybe, 3 o'clock in the morning. I have myself stood outside on an unlit London street and read a newspaper at 3:30 in the morning without any help from any artificial lighting, because by that time it was bright enough so that you could read newsprint. And that is the condition that pertains in England during the summertime. So in the summertime, workers went to work at a very early hour, and because the sunlight continued through the day and on into the evening, in fact, it doesn't even begin to get dark until around 9 o'clock, and you can see pretty well up till 9:30 or 10. In the summertime, the days were very, very long, and people worked very long hours when they had the light to work by. What about the winter? Well, in the winter, the reverse is true. And in the winter, it doesn't begin to be daylight in England until possibly 9:30 or 10 in the morning. And then twilight comes early, and by 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon, it's too dark to do any work. So the fact is that the businessmen asked their workers to work very long hours during the summer and very short hours during the winter, because interior lighting, which had to depend either on candles or on oil lamps or things of this sort, which are very costly and very inefficient, just wasn't adequate for the kind of work that required a good, bright light inside to do any work at all. Thus, the consequence is that during the summertime, the workers worked very long hours. During the wintertime, they worked very short hours. Now, when did the workers complain? Well, they complained both summer and winter. Workers always complain. In the summertime, they complained because the hours were too long. The days sometimes running 10, 11, 12, and even 14 and 16-hour days are not unknown. And that is a very long time. That's true. But in the winter, they would work maybe 4 to 6 hours. And they would complain in the winter because they didn't get enough in the way of earnings, because as they worked fewer hours, their earnings declined accordingly. And this, of course, nobody likes. So you have a general condition that is dealing with the geography of the time, in which workers worked very long hours part of the year and very short hours the rest of the year. But you very rarely find this mentioned in the accounts that are written up about the Industrial Revolution. It is taken for granted that all of the industrialists were working everybody 14, 15, and 16-hour days. That's not true. Part of the time it is true. Part of the time the reverse is true. You have to take a look at it and put it in its context to see what really did happen. Now let's take the question of women and children working. Is it true that women and children were admitted into the factories? Yes, of course it is true. As a matter of fact, a very curious thing developed in England. We know, in fact, that about 90% of the population of England, exclusive of the servant class and of the class of clerics, which are often considered in this same grouping, and who did have employment, with those exceptions, about 90% of the population was unemployed. There was certainly an available workforce. And yet the great curiosity is that businessmen found real difficulty in hiring people to work in the factories. Here you have better than half of the people of England substantially unemployed, suffering starvation and deprivation of every description, and yet they wouldn't take a job in the factories. That's an interesting thing. And so the businessmen were very anxious to hire anyone who would work, and if he could find a woman or a child who was willing to work, the chances were rather good that the woman or the child would find employment. The reason for this, and there probably are many reasons, but one of the reasons that we have detected is that a regular campaign of abuse and vilification of the factories was launched through the various pulpits in England. The church itself took a stand against factory labor. They didn't want it. One of the reasons for this, of course, was that some of the businessmen, when they had a large contract or a rush order, would ask their workers to work on Sunday. And this cut into church attendance. And naturally, the ministers and the pastors did not approve of this, because Sunday is a holy day and is supposed to be free from labor. And the consequence is that they branded the industrialization in England as the devil's work, and they indicated that the satanic forces were behind industrialization, and that the workers taking work in a factory were demonstrating a lack of faith. After all, it says in the Scriptures that you should not consider things of this sort. Consider the lilies and how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. And, of course, there was the idea that faith itself, if you have the necessary faith, it can move mountains, and therefore, if you have enough faith, your daily bread will be provided. There was nothing in Scriptures that suggested to these people that you had to work for it. And the consequence was, as they interpreted the Scriptures at that time, that it seemed to them that the church militant was against the idea of the factories. And consequently, it became a matter of public disfavor for a person to take work in a factory or a mill where he would have a regular wage. Indeed, he was called a wage slave, having sold himself to the devil just in exchange for daily bread, whereas, in fact, if he had had the proper faith, he should have been able to get his daily bread some other way, you see. And this was the kind of thinking that made it imperative that businessmen take almost anybody that would show up. As a matter of fact, we find some businessmen hiring cripples, a practice I might point out that is going on today, and usually a very rewarding one, because the handicapped often make excellent workers. They're very eager to work and to use what skills they have and to demonstrate that they are as good as anyone else. They make excellent employees, and the consequence was that at this time, many people who had been crippled, possibly from birth or perhaps from an accident of some sort, found employment in the mills and factories. And there is no doubt, but many of the people who took a jaundiced view of the factories attributed the crippling to the factories, because they saw people going in and out of factories who were crippled. And therefore, they leaped to the conclusion that it was in the factory that the crippling occurred. Of course, we cannot give the factories a clean bill of health, then or now. Accidents happen. A factory is a dangerous place. And there certainly are abundant records indicating that here and there an accident occurred, here and there possibly even a death would ensue as a result of the danger from high-speed machinery, from cutting edges, from furnaces, or things of this sort. They did not understand how to box in the machinery at first. They didn't know whether they could do it and still make the machinery function. And so there was a lot of experimentation going on, but to begin with, the machinery in the mills was unprotected, and this meant that a careless worker could damage himself, sometimes irreparably, and the accident rate, by our standards, was relatively high. So, again, you see how circumstances tended to make the businessman look like a villain, whereas in point of fact, if you'll consider it, the businessman was trying to make the situation as good as he could. For additional evidence in this score, let me take the matter of children. One of the sources of child labor, of course, was the wandering child who had been sent from his family at an early age. This seems incredible to us, but it was standard policy in those early days for a man to call his son to him when the son had reached the ripe old age of 8. And he would say to his son, "Young man, you are now grown up enough to take care of yourself, and you must now leave the family home and go out and seek your fortune." And so we find hundreds of waifs dispossessed from their homes, young boys, very young boys, without education and without other benefits, simply wandering around looking for something to do, or stealing from the populace, or scrounging any way that they could. If the child could become apprenticed, well, that was an advantage, of course, or if he could be perhaps adopted into a major household that could afford him, why, that was a big advantage. But undoubtedly this practice of letting the children go out at such an early age led in part to the high death rate, which of course was highest among children and was very, very high in the period preceding the Industrial Revolution. Another source of child labor was this. When a man would finally decide that he would take work at a factory or mill and would call there seeking employment and would get the job, because quite frankly they were hiring almost anybody that was warm, his first question was, well, could you take in the missus too? Is there work for her? After all, that would double the family income. And usually there was. Well, if you're going to have the missus of the house employed too, then what of the children? Mother won't be at home to look after them. Is there something the wee ones can do in the factory? And in order to obtain able-bodied men and able-bodied women, many employers also open the doors to the children. And we find instance after instance of whole family groups coming to work in the factory, where actually the discipline leveled against the child was exercised primarily by his parents and not by the foreman at all. These are not rare instances. They occur in plenitude. However, they are not necessarily the only source of child labor or of female labor that was available to the factories at this early time. A third source of child labor relates to the orphanages. And here we have a very interesting situation. If perhaps you have seen Dickens' Oliver, the current production, or possibly you have read some of Dickens' stories, such as Oliver Twist and the other stories of which he was such a master, you are aware of the condition in the British orphanages. They were dreadful. Dickens paints a very graphic and quite accurate picture of the conditions that the children faced in these orphanages. So far as I've been able to learn, virtually all of the orphanages, if not all, were government institutions. And when the orphan was put into the orphanage, it was a usual practice for Parliament to appropriate a small stipend to send over to look after the child during the time that he stayed in the orphanage. These stipends were very small, and a good manager of an orphan would have to take care of that money very carefully and spend it very parsimoniously for it to last the number of years that the orphan might be with him. And there is no doubt in my mind that some of the orphanage managers, acquainted with the facts of reality that faced them, might very well have figured that the quicker the child died, the better it would be for them financially and for the financial strength of their institution. Certainly the lot of the children in orphanages was cruel, and the hardships that they experienced there was very, very bad. On the contrary, it was probably better than would have happened to these orphans had they been free to wander about, because there no one was taking care of them at all. In the orphanages, at least they did get some food and some shelter, though of course they were often asked to work very hard in exchange. We find instances of businessmen approaching the orphanages and sometimes buying orphans to come and work for them in their factories. Or we have instances, at least one instance, where an orphanage manager turned over, apparently without payment, all of his charges, and they all went to work in a neighborhood textile mill. There were instances of this sort. But the interesting thing, and it is deserving of study, is the comparative death rate of children in orphanages and children in factories. Because here we have good statistics, and it works out that the children working in the orphanages, or confined in the orphanages where they actually did work, enjoyed perhaps the highest death rate in England, if the term enjoyed is used, which of course is a misnomer. Actually, the death rate in one of the orphanages, we are told, rose as high as 85%. That is to say, out of every 100 children, only 15 survived. Now, that's a very high death rate. What is the death rate of children working in factories? Almost zero. The children who got into the factories and mills obviously had a much better chance at survival and a much better chance to enjoy good health and a livelihood than they would have had if they'd stayed in the orphanages. And yet the orphanages were managed by the government, and the mills were managed by private persons who were seeking fundamentally to enjoy profit. So here you see a very interesting turn of events that has been held up in such a way as to make us believe that the businessmen were unconscionable villains, and yet, in point of fact, when you examine it, you find that they really weren't that bad. Let me take one other case. It's a very interesting one. It relates to the accusation that children were sometimes chained to their benches. And I found one case where this had happened, where the children in a factory were actually chained to their benches. But not, as you suppose, a bench where they worked. On the contrary, it was a bench where they sat when they weren't working. The story is like this. In this particular mill, it was a textile mill, these young men were employed as doffers. Now, that's a particular type of job that requires the young fellows to go to a spinning machine where the threads come out and are wound on spindles. When the run of the mill finishes and the spools are full, then the doffers go up to the machine and they break the thread, take the spool off that's full and pack it in a box. Meanwhile, they put on a new spool, and they tie the remaining thread on that so that the machine can start up again. And the whole idea is to do this for that machine as quickly as possible. Well, some of the spinning mules that they had could contain as many as 1,200 spindles, and they might have only maybe 8 or 9 boys taking care of such a machine. That meant that those lads had to learn how to be very dexterous, very rapid, and they would charge in and take care of their machine as quickly as possible so that machine could get back into production as quickly as they could. But this only happened about every 40 minutes, 50 minutes, and the children worked very hard during that time for a few minutes, and then they had the better part of an hour with nothing to do. So they used to go outside and play ball. And it happened that rainy weather descended in this one place, and the children couldn't go out. They began to play their games inside the factory, and one of them slipped and fell into a machine and was killed. The foreman ordered them back to the bench. They went back to the bench, but they became restless again with the passing of time, and they began to play their games once more. And finally, in order to protect the lives of the children, this foreman actually chained them to the bench to keep them out of mischief. Now, that particular report has come down, making it appear that the foreman was sort of chaining them to their jobs and extracting the last ounce of human energy from them in order to increase production. In point of fact, he was trying to save their lives. I'm not recommending chaining as a good way of dealing with employees, but when you understand the context in which the event occurred, you can understand that it was to the advantage of businessmen to keep their employees healthy and to keep them working well. Thank you.